Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
And Rodney, our guest today is best-selling author and podcaster Chris Bolinger. In addition to his duties as the co-host of the Throwing Mountains podcast, Chris is the author of the popular devotional titled Daily Strength for Men, which has sold over 300,000 copies. Chris's latest devotional is 52 Weeks of Strength for Men, which tackles topics like the one we'll address today, avoiding pride. Finally, Chris and his wife, Libby, split their time between Southwest Florida and Northeast Ohio. Chris, thank you for joining us today on the StrongTeams.com podcast.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Rodney. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and let me add my welcome too. I'm grateful that you're here, Chris, and I know you and I had an opportunity to spend some time together when you guys interviewed me on your Throwing Mountains podcast, which is just great. I love what you guys do over that. We'll provide a link for that down in the footer as well, so that people that might have an interest in listening to your podcast over there as well. So, you know, what we like to do when we get started here, Chris, is we really like to get to know you personally. And so I'd like to start with you maybe telling our listeners a little bit more about you, your family, your background. We already know kind of where you live, but might expound on that a little bit and just help us understand you more personally.
Sure thing. Well, even though I've written a couple of men's devotionals, I like to say that I'm really an average Joe Christian, just kind of an average Joe in general. Went to public school. Went to a public university, University of Akron, Go Zips, who are known mostly for their soccer program, and, and that's about it. I didn't go to seminary. I really don't have any credentials when it comes to writing something like a men's devotional. My testimony is really pretty boring. I was raised in a Christian home. Thank God. I mean, I think we discount that sometimes. I was raised in a Christian home, and that was terrific. Became a Christian at an early age, never really walked away, never really had significant doubts in my faith, but didn't really do a whole lot with my faith until I wrote Daily Strength for Men back in 2017. My kids are actually more accomplished in the Christian realm than I am, if you want to put it that way. I've got 3 kids. My my 2 daughters, is married to a pastor, and she's raising 3 kids in a godly home. My other daughter, younger daughter, is an accomplished author of Christian novels. She's written, I've lost track, even though she's only 26, I think she's written and had published at least 15 at this point. I think it'll be 25 by the end of next year. Just phenomenal. And my son is pursuing a biblical studies degree and wants to be a worship leader in a church. So I'm just a dad of 3 great kids who are, as I said, much more accomplished in the Christian world than I ever have been. I spent most of my career in the tech world. Started off as a software engineer and then moved into product management, which I did for a couple of decades. And to this day, I see a lot of things, not just in the business world, but in life in general, through a product management lens. And I can describe that later if we have time. But it was a great discipline to pick up because it's very multifaceted, and it really gives you a well-rounded perspective of what's happening in a business or in an organization. So I really appreciated that time doing that. Late in my career, 5 of us left very good, comfortable jobs at Cisco Systems and started a Wi-Fi startup in little old Akron, Ohio, in an old B.F. Goodrich factory building of all things. And God blessed the business, and 6 years to the day after we started it, we sold it. So I had every intention of retiring at that point. I did about 18 more months in the acquiring company, retired in 2013, had every plan to basically just enjoy my retirement and then 4 years later, everything caved in. My wife of 26 years left, and the marriage was ended in divorce. So that really changed my life, in many ways for the worse. But what it did for me was it gave me a common bond with other divorced men. And while I was married, I did married things. I went to small groups with my wife and, a couple small groups, and did married things in the church and outside, and never really paid attention to divorced people. And then suddenly I was divorced, and I said, wow, it's like I came out of a cave. Look at all these divorced men out here. I wonder what they're going through, and discovered what they were going through. So my life verse has become the beginning of 2 Corinthians, first chapter, first couple of verses, where it talks about how God is a God of all comfort, and he comforts us in our affliction so that we can comfort others who are going through similar things. And that's really become very important to me, to be able to use this tragedy in my own life to try to benefit other men who've been through something similar.
Yeah. So is that kind of what the impetus was for you to write the 52 Weeks of Strength for Men?
Almost. I was still married at the time when I started the project. I had been through 4 years of a terrific men's ministry called Christ-Led Communities, or CLC. Before that, I really didn't have any close male friends. I mean, maybe a couple, but none in my church. In the business world, in the sports world, throughout my life, I had always been very competitive with men and kept men at arm's length. And then I got into this in-depth men's ministry where you really got to know other men, and you developed these Christian brothers, which I never had before. And it changed my life. And so at the end of that 4-year period, I said, well, maybe I should give back in some way. So I decided that in my naivete, haven't written anything other than a marketing brief. I decided, hey, what if I wrote a men's devotional? Never having any idea how difficult it would be. And then in the middle of the project, my wife said, hey, I bought a house. I'm leaving. But God walked with me through that. I never felt closer to God than the time that I was writing that first book. And God's really blessed it. I mean, you'll find it in your local supermarket, your Walmart, gas stations. It's on the inspirational reading rack from Choice Books in a lot of places. And it's been, as Steve said, I mean, over 300,000 people have bought this book, and that's all God. I mean, I'm a first-time writer, just tried to put down some things that I thought men would find interesting, and it's been blessed many times over.
Well, in a world where very few men are authentic, and I know that's saying like every man is not authentic, which is not true, but it tends to be that way in the church. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we talk about this word pride, I think. And without that authenticity and transparency, right, it's difficult to actually, walk in the light with other people. And I'm grateful that God led you into that place, and that he's led you out of that place, and that through your contribution, it will help men right where they are, and it will fulfill your call to come alongside those and try and help them with what you've been helped with. And so you and I, we've already mentioned the Throwing Mountains podcast, but I'd like to talk just for a minute about some of the issues that you guys cover on the Throwing Mountain podcast, just as kind of a cross-marketing opportunity here. So why don't you speak to that a little bit? What are some of the topics y'all deal with on Throwing Mountains podcast, and how often does that release?
We do an episode a week. We'll miss a week here or there. But overall, we do an episode a week. And we've been doing it for almost 2.5 years. When we started off, we essentially wanted to have any topic that would be of interest to men. Christian men, or maybe men who aren't Christians but are interested in the faith. Just anything that would enrich and strengthen men. So we've covered a broad range of topics, everything from addiction and the effects of trauma on men to, men in the workplace, where you find your strength with other men. But what we found over the past 2.5 years, we've had one consistency in our podcast, and that's we always start off by having men tell us what we call their fence post story, which is similar to the little bio that I gave on myself, but it's more, what are those anchors in your life? Who are those key people or those key events that have really anchored your life and helped define who you are today? And what we found, Rodney, is that when a man tells his fence post story, it may be the first time he's told it. And that just becomes a springboard into exploring something in that story. And as a writer of devotionals, I get to kind of hide behind other people. I tell other people's stories for the most part. I really don't like to talk about myself, because stories are not just interesting, they're kind of defining. Someone tells you a story and he's revealing, like you mentioned authenticity, he's really revealing himself to you through what he's been through and the people that he's interacted with. And we've just found that so valuable. Sometimes our podcast will go for an hour. Basically, we're just a guy telling his story. So we've really found that to be enriching for us, and we hope for our listeners.
Yeah, it is very enriching, and I would encourage anyone listening to the podcast to go check it out. It's Throwing Mountains, and it's very, very powerful. And I love to listen to them. I love to listen to the story, and it's always fascinating how deep you guys go with some of your listeners, and I mean some of your the people that you're interviewing, and so it can get deep really, really quick. I know one of the really tough topics that you deal with in this latest devotional in which you've written is the sin of pride. And so to kind of make a transition here, can you describe what sinful pride looks like versus healthy pride?
Well, my expert here, again, being kind of an everyman or an average Joe type Christian, I went to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, his Mere Christianity is one of my favorite books. And it's actually a series of radio addresses that Lewis did back in World War II. I mean, Britain was in bad shape. They were being bombed. People were in need of encouragement. And so the BBC was impressed with Lewis, so they had him do a series of addresses. I think he actually ended up doing 3 or 4 series, all of them 10, 15 minutes long. And one of them was he did a series on Christian behavior, and one of them was on pride. And according to Lewis, and in my own personal experience, I don't know if there is healthy pride. I mean, you can be proud of somebody else, but I think when you start being proud of yourself, you're straying into an area where you probably don't want to go too deeply. Lewis actually called pride the worst sin there is. He called it the great sin. And I don't think I have time to read a lot of what he said on here, but I'll just read a quick excerpt from Mere Christianity. There's one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine they are guilty themselves. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. And that's pride. And he talks about how pride is basically the sin of the devil. It's wanting to be God of your own life, and basically eventually imagining that you are. That what you think of yourself and what you think in general and what you do is more important than what other people think or do, and more important than what God wants you to do.
Yeah, it's like pride. At the core of pride is I need nothing else. And, at the core of humility is I can do nothing without. And it sounds simple, but it's the most difficult thing, especially for men to do, to admit that they're insufficient or that they're short or that they don't have something, especially in this thing we call America, right? Where we have to be all things and we have to be everything, and it's all about winning, and so it just definitely breeds that pride. And I think that's interesting. There is no healthy pride. And I think it would just be good to expound on that just a little bit more. I know that you read C.S. Lewis's quote there, and I think that cements it a little bit. But expound just a tick more on that there's really no place for self-pride anywhere.
Right. Well, I mean, this is the sin that I struggle with the most. I think that's probably true for a lot of men, but I can only speak for myself. I think that because I'm such a competitive person, and because I worked in marketing for 2 decades, I mean, in marketing, you're always trying to extol the benefits of your product, and you tend to de-emphasize or even hide the weaknesses of your offering. And then you talk about competitive products in exactly the opposite way. And you mentioned, I mean, we are in a competitive world. We're trying to get ahead, whether we're in the workplace, the marketplace, or in a church setting, wherever we are. It's difficult to shed this idea that we have to elevate ourselves above others. And that just feeds pride like there's no tomorrow. So, Lewis went into, some of the symptoms of pride, but I think the biggest issue with pride, as he mentions, is that it becomes invisible to you. You feel like, and it's difficult for men, I think, because men don't get a lot of encouragement in this society. We're told what we're doing wrong all the time, and it wears you down. And so to counter that, instead of turning to Christ and admitting that, yeah, I did screw up again, I need help, instead of having that humility, we tend to buttress against the negative feedback that we're getting by elevating ourselves and by taking more pride in ourselves. So it's a dangerous thing, but it's a difficult thing to really shed.
I really like that last point you made, Chris. And I think why I like that last point is that the point transcends all socioeconomic levels. Sometimes people associate pride with the uber successful, but I think that whatever stage of life you're in, and I'll speak as a male. Whatever stage of life you're in as a male, I think that you struggle with pride. When you're not at a place you want to be, you figure out a way to make it look like you're at a place that you want to be, or you're going to make excuses or something like that. But so I appreciate that point, and I always appreciate a good C.S. Lewis reference. You can never go wrong with that. So I appreciate you being prepared with that. That'll definitely really, I think, inspire our listeners. As you know, Chris, we're the strongteams.com podcast, so we always like to take a leadership angle on our topics. And so I'll ask you this question. Rodney, you can chime in as well. Why do you think ministry leaders and pastors in particular struggle with pride so much? We're seeing it more and more publicly these days. Pastors, ministry leaders falling hard, and it often comes back to issues of pride and kind of how pride got them into places that they shouldn't have been.
I have a real soft spot for ministry leaders. I mean, my son-in-law is one. I've got a son-in-law who's pastor. But even before my daughter got married, I actually spent my first couple years after my retirement from high tech. I started a small business called Revitalized Ministries. And my goal was to help small church leaders because I had been in a small church most of my life, and all ministry leaders, but I think small church pastors especially, just have an impossible job. I mean, think about all the things that a small church pastor has to do. He's got to be the CEO of the church, if you want to look at it that way. He's got to give a winning sermon every Sunday. He's got to be a shepherd to the flock. He's got to do all the administrative work. He's got to comfort people in need. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And unfortunately, in our society, and this has been going on for a long time, people pick on the one thing that he doesn't do necessarily well, right? So if he's a terrific shepherd, but his sermons are really not that great, they pick on his sermons. If he gives a great sermon, but he's not a good shepherd, then it's the opposite. So I think that not just small church leaders, but all ministry leaders get a lot of negative feedback. They don't get that encouragement that I talked about. So lots of criticism, few kudos. And I think also increasingly in the church world, there's a lot more comparisons. You'll see this in big churches, obviously. I mean, go to a big church conference, and what do they talk about? Everybody talks about numbers. How many guys you have in your men's ministry? How many couples do you have in your small groups? What are you drawing on Sunday mornings? How many services do you have? Numbers, 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 just like the business world. And in small churches, I mean, you're fighting against a tide of, shrinking numbers and aging congregations. So I think that there's just a ton of comparisons out there. And so why do ministry leaders struggle with pride? Well, we all do, but I think that they're under a microscope and they're just in a very high stress profession where they're expected to do everything right and they just can't. So they buttress themselves by sometimes turning to pride.
Yeah, I was reading an article, not to get on a rabbit trail here, but I was reading an article just yesterday about narcissism and ministry these days and how is it more prevalent? It does seem to be more prevalent. And the author went on to talk about unhealthy narcissism and then went down a road of talking about healthy narcissism, which honestly I didn't agree with. But this point was just saying that in order to succeed in today's ministry landscape, that these leaders have to have a lot of motivation, and sometimes they have to keep themselves motivated. And to do that, they've got to have a lot of inner, for lack of a better term, kind of narcissism and pride. And I like I said, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I got I got the nugget of truth out of it. And it's just unfortunate that there's just so many ways that Satan can use pride and kind of sneak that into your psyche, sneak that into your situation. Whether it's because you're receiving on one end of the spectrum, you're receiving a lot of criticism. On the other end of the spectrum, you're trying to find a way to overcome obstacles and be the most successful version of yourself. There's just so many ways that it can sneak in.
There's something else that a lot of ministry leaders don't have, and a lot of men don't have it in general. I mentioned it early on, and that's brothers around you who can hold you accountable. It's really tough for pastors. Again, I think of small church pastors, who are you going to talk to? You can talk to your wife, but, who else? You can't talk to anybody in the congregation, right? I mean, who's going to be your accountability partner in the congregation? It's tough. And I think it's true in big churches as well. And so when you don't have a lot of people whom you trust, who will hold you accountable in a loving Christian way, you're left with yourself. And that's a dangerous place to be.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if, that just the fact that today's world is so social media fueled, if you will. I wonder if that is one of the many contributing factors to why it's hard for pastors to remain humble before others. There's just so much, visibility now for the work that they do. I don't know if you or Rodney have any thoughts on that, but it's definitely a different world than it was even just 10 years ago. If you're, whether you're working in ministry or any other industry, we're all very connected in ways that, it just wasn't happening not long ago.
I think it's made it much, much more challenging for ministry leaders for a couple of reasons. One, I think of Instagram immediately, but I think all social media platforms are guilty of this. It's an artificial world where everybody's comparing, people to other people. And so everybody's putting their best fake foot forward, right? I mean, you never show pictures of, here's what my house looked like today, or I was arguing with my wife all the way to church, here's a picture of us arguing in the car. Nobody does that, right? So it's a very phony platform. All of them are where you're marketing yourself, for lack of a better term. You're putting your best foot out there, your best impression out there. In addition, now people are judging or evaluating churches based on their online presence. And so you may have a great church where there's great relationships, deep relationships, people are growing in their faith, you're discipling people. How are you going to show that in a 15-second blurb on your website or on social media? My friend David Murrow, who wrote Why Men Hate Going to Church, he now is specializing in helping pastors get good video clips on their websites, because without that, they have no standing in this new world that we've created. So I think that, and there's the endless comparison. So I think that, yeah, social media and the online world in general has just made pride a bigger trap and a tougher thing to shake.
Yeah, we don't even know what's true or what's real or what's not, right? It's all perception and and very little reality. We make our reality what we want it to be. And at the core of that is pride and arrogance, right? And so instead of humility would say, this is where it is and this is where the cards lay. And my life is messy, or this was a messy day, or whatever, but God's going to see me through it. We have no need of God when our day is perfect, or at least when we put on the persona that it was. And so I'd be really interesting for you maybe to pull a couple of scripture verses that our listeners might be able to hold tight to, maybe from your devotional around this word. How do we become more humble and Christ-filled as leaders and as men? Do you have a few that you might be able to share with us?
I've got one that's fairly lengthy, and I'll lead into it again by turning to Lewis. So at the end of his section on pride, Lewis says, well, what does a humble person look like? We talked this entire 15-minute radio address on what proud people look like and what they struggle with. He says a humble person he would strike you as a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. So it's somebody who gives you the appearance, and it's genuine, that he really cares about you, and he puts you ahead of himself, whether it's a conversation or you express a need to him. And that's right out of Philippians 2. So let me read Philippians 2. I included this in my chapter on pride, but I think it's worth reading. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection or sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. And then the rest of that section goes on, and it's basically, it's based on an early Christian hymn, where they talk about how Jesus was in very nature God, but he basically gave all that up and humbled himself and took on the form of a servant in human likeness, and then was obedient all the way to the cross. And thus, his name is elevated above every other name. So there's a lot of other passages that I include in the chapter, but to me, that's the essence of humility. First, if you're going to compare yourself to somebody, compare yourself to Christ. That'll humble you very quickly. And then, look at the example of Christ, but then in day-to-day life, consider other people more important than you are, because in reality, they are. We're all equally important in God's eyes, but in the moment, that person is more important than you, so treat him that way. And that's the essence of being humble.
20 years ago, if we would have asked, what's the golden rule? Everybody would have been able to tell us what it is. Today, if we ask people what's the golden rule, they probably look at you with a blank stare, right? It's like it's in this space of, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's like this mutual respect and this honor and esteeming others higher than yourself. And really taking on that life of a servant. I mean, Paul tells us that it's our spiritual act of worship when we actually give ourselves to our brothers and sisters. Excuse me. And so, I think we've lost sight of how to kind of give everything away. Everything's about what I can get. And it's all take. But at the core of the gospel, it's all give. It's all with no strings attached. It's about giving what I have to you and to others so that I might see you flourish and I might see you living life to the full. And in that brings great joy to me, and it honors my Father. And man, it's just not kind of our core ethos anymore. When we hear it, we go, oh, I mean, that was refreshing, right? And it's like, is it really that simple? Well, it really is. And so what's the role of prayer in this whole avoiding pride? I mean, I'm sure prayer has to play a big role in avoiding pride in oneself. Could you speak to that?
I agree. I think that prayer is an essential part of this, and for me, prayer is where you really get down to brass tacks and you personalize things. I mean, you're having a conversation with God. God knows you better than you know yourself. He knows where you've messed up. He knows where you're proud. Um, but I think that in praying to God, we can reflect on ourselves, and we can realize where we struggle, and then we can personalize that in our conversation with God. So I think you need to be specific, which is very painful. I mean, especially for me, like I said, this is a recurring theme with me. I would love to be a humble person. I struggle with this every day, and I need to go to God and say, you know, luckily God's infinitely patient, because He's seen me make these same mistakes over and over again, but He gives me another shot. So I humble myself with Him. I get specific about where I'm struggling, and then I think we can pray. One of my favorite prayers from Psalm 51: "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit." Just, that we have that daily need for God to wash us clean, and
Yeah, when I'm praying and communing with God, and His Spirit is speaking to me, there's nothing that speaks into my heart more than the Spirit of God when I'm communing with Him. And when He speaks into my heart, now I can look that kind of square in the eye, and I can go, I am struggling with that. And I do need to lay that at the foot of the cross. And it gives me that opportunity to, with just me and God, to lay it at the foot of the cross, and then worship Him for forgiving me of that, and washing me, as you stated, from that, and then through the power of His Holy Spirit, being able to walk differently tomorrow than I did yesterday, because now I've dealt with that in my life, in my communion with God. And I think those are really, really powerful times. And we think a prayer is asking God what He can do for us, right? Or what problem we'd like for Him to solve now. And I really like to just commune with God in prayer, and within a real intimate space with Him, and let Him speak to my heart, because He's the only one that can change a man's heart, and the power of His Spirit. I'm sure there's a million things we haven't asked here today. We try and be thorough, Stevie and I, in crafting our questions for you, Chris, and the research that we've done on you. But is there anything that we've kind of missed here today that you think that our listeners would find of value, that you'd really like to say before we close out our time together?
I can't think of anything, but I'll share my contact information in a minute. I would love to have people. When I was a product manager, I got a lot of feedback. I was talking to customers, prospective customers. I was doing research, and I felt like I got more information flowing to me than I sometimes knew what to do with. Now I'm sitting here in Fort Myers, Florida, and I'm trying to deliver resources to men that will benefit men. But I have a limited circle of men that I talk to, and I would just love, when people have emailed me in the past, they've often given me great ideas and great feedback that I can use moving forward. So that's my primary request from your listeners. If they got some value from this, or even if they didn't, if they disagree with everything that I said, I'd love to have some feedback, just so I can do a better job in the future.
Yeah, that's great. So where could listeners find you?
Website is mensdevotionals.com. And the best email is probably chris@mensdevotionals.com. I'm also on the dreaded social media. I'm not on TikTok yet, but I think my kids are going to convince me that I eventually have to be there. But I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. Let me just rattle those off real fast, and then maybe you can put them in the show notes. But Facebook is Daily Strength for Men. Instagram is chris.bolinger, Bolinger. LinkedIn is Chris Bolinger with no dot. And X or Twitter is Bolinger. So just the last name. I actually got on Twitter really early, like when it just came out. So I got my last name with nothing else. And I did nothing with it for like the first 10 years except just kind of sit there. But I'm getting a little more active on Twitter now that Elon owns it and has opened it up a little bit. So that's where I am.
Once again, our guest has been Chris Bolinger, and we're grateful, Chris, for you spending time with us today. Our listeners, I know, will gain a lot from our time and all the wisdom that you have shared with them. If you're looking for him, once again, that's at mensdevotionals.com, mensdevotional.com. You can always find him at 52 Weeks of Strength as well, 52weeksofstrengths.com, and all the other places that he mentioned. We will put links down below so that you can get to that very easily. We'll also link you over to the Throwing Mountains podcast, so anybody that's interested in connecting with that, you can as well. Once again, thanks for your time today, Chris. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Rodney. Thanks, Steve.
You bet. Until we meet again, God bless.